Hi, welcome to another episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. So, just what are the legacies of slavery? Our guest today will be helping us to understand how universities were entangled in the slave trade. But before we meet this erudite scholar and poet, please continue to support us by clicking on your subscription and notification buttons. Thank you. Dr. Afua Cooper holds a PhD in Black Canadian Studies and the African Diaspora from the University of Toronto. She's a tenured full-time professor at Dalhousie University's Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, with cross appointments in the Department of History and Gender and Women's Studies. Dr. Cooper is a multidisciplinary scholar and artist whose contributions to society includes the literary arts, history, humanities, education, and human and civil rights. Her 12 books range across genres as history, poetry, fiction, and children's literature. Dr. Cooper served as the Poet Laureate of Halifax Regional Municipality between 2018 and 2020. Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series, Dr. Afua Cooper. It's a real pleasure having you on the series.
Thank you.
We hear this word all the time, triangular trade. What is the triangular slave trade?
The triangular trade, or the triangular slave trade, speaks to a trading system that in theory and in practice was premised on this Atlantic slaving system that connected 3 points within the Atlantic world. Mm-hmm. And so why it's used a lot, or why it's used to capture this the essence of the slaving system, was because as I said, was premised on 3 points. So let's say the first point begins, and first point could begin anywhere, right? So we're talking about Europe, we're talking about West Africa, we're talking about the Americas. So for example, manufactured goods would be taken from Europe, so that's pots, pans, cloth, fabric, guns, gunpowder, bullets, taken to West Africa, where these items were exchanged for captive Africans, who were then loaded on ships in the bottom of ships, taken across the Atlantic Ocean, which is that area is called the Middle Passage. It's a stretch of sea between West Africa and the Americas. So captive Africans were then taken across the Atlantic to the so-called New World, to Virginia, to Jamaica, to Brazil, to Antigua, to Barbados, where they were sold to plantation owners. And these people would then produce the tropical goods, or the tropical crops, the sugarcane, the cotton, the rice, etc., that the planters in the New World would send to Europe. Sometimes in the same slave ship. So if the slave ship arrives, let's say in Jamaica, they would clean out the ship, because you can imagine the condition, just the filth on the ship. They would clean it, disinfect it, and load the sugar, for example, in barrels, the rum, the molasses, and ship these items to Europe. So this trade speaks to the connection of the 3 points, and it repeats itself. It's a system that really was in continuous motion over the course of 3-4 centuries. The essence of it was the brutalization, the abuse, the criminal brutalization of Black people, of Black people's bodies, of captive Africans who were enslaved, who had their labor robbed from them, and not just their specific individual labor, but this robbery was generational. It happened over the course of several centuries, as I've said before. Another point on this, a very important point, is that it's from this system that the wealth of the world was built. The wealth of Europe was built. Europe exported the items, the goods that they were produced by free African labor to the rest of the world, literally, and built its wealth and got its power from this trading system. So, I always say to people that the labor of Africans built this world, and not just our labor, but our intellectual prowess. They stole because our intellect is also capital, and that was also stolen from us to produce wealth for white people.
Which brings me to my next question, because slavery ended on paper, but the legacies of slavery and the slave trade are still with us. What are some of those legacies?
The legacies are manifold. They are numerous. And I will just speak to a few, because as you said, when slavery ended legally, um, and officially, you didn't have Black equality. Black people were still not equal to white people. They didn't enjoy the rights and privileges of the society that they themselves helped to build. So, in the Canadian Parliament, I think a week ago, they officialized Emancipation Day. Emancipation Day in the British imperial world was August 1st. August 1st, 1834, the enslaved people in most parts of the British colonial world were freed by, this act of the Westminster Parliament. And so the Canadian government recently declared August 1st an official day for celebration across the country. Even though, Black people in Canada and the Caribbean have been celebrating Emancipation Day since 1834. But at the same time, so it officialized the ending of slavery. But at the same time, it took another 100 years, for example, in the British Caribbean for Black people to be able to vote. And they got that because of rebellion. They rebelled the 1938 labor riots and strikes in the British Caribbean. When slavery ended, what was reinstated was a system of what some people call racial apartheid. So they removed the chains, they said you're free, but the white planter class or the white ruling class still held on to the reins of power. They were dominant in the political world. They still controlled the economy. They controlled the land. And land in that time was the basis, and still in this time, was the basis of wealth in order to create wealth and empowerment. They control all the reins of society. They held on to the reins that would make that could, if they just released it even a little, Black people would have been able to acquire what was necessary to self-actualize. And so they held on to these things, and they knew exactly what they were doing, because they knew that August 2nd, 1834, the day after the act was passed, that Black people would still have to return to the fields to labor, right? Because, one of the crimes that the British government committed against the Black community was that they released the slaves or the enslaved people, but they paid compensation to the white masters, to the owners. They believed so much in this notion of property, and they believed so much that Black people were property. And it's intrinsic in British common law to recognize the property principle. And so they said, well, these white planters, they have lost their property. We must compensate them. The property were the enslaved people, but they didn't give the property anything. So even though Emancipation Act was passed, it was such a racist piece of legislation, because once again, it it reconfirmed what white people had been thinking for a century, that Black people were not quite human, that they were property. And in doing so, by not giving, I mean, in the British world, Black people have been slaving for the Brits for over 250 years.
Mm.
And when emancipation came, they didn't even give them a dollar and say, hey, go do your thing, do whatever, here's some little money. Nothing. So one of the legacies is this second class citizenship that, as you said, is still playing out today. There's this feeling of unbelonging, like we still don't belong in these societies. And, in the United States, emancipation happened 1865, in Brazil, 1888. And still in all these societies, including Canada, you see Black people still having a second class, a third class kind of citizenship, because we're still not fully incorporated into the body politic. That is why you could have the public murder of George Floyd and many others like him,
Yeah.
because we are still not seen as full citizens of whichever country. And it leads me into the second point of one of the other legacies of slavery, is that of mass incarceration.
Mm.
You see the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on Black bodies, right? We're speaking now of Canada. Certainly it happens in other parts of the world, in Jamaica, in Brazil, in the United States, but in Canada, we see this phenomenon. We know that over the past 10 years, the incarceration rate of Black people, especially Black men, in the federal prison system has increased by 50%. Now, Black people only make up something like 2.3% of the total Canadian population.
Mm.
And so, that links to our citizenship status, which is citizenship minus, or there's this book called Citizens Minus. The third point I want to bring is the health impact. And this flows directly from slavery. During the enslavement period, the diet of Black people, the enslaved people, was terrible. High in sugar content, high in salt content. In the Caribbean, for example, we have, and this is a fact which is you can easily verify, the highest rate of diabetes, right? We also in the Caribbean have the highest rate of what you call it, when you have to take off people's limbs, dismemberment, because of diabetes complications. So, especially the feet, toes, right? We also suffer high rates of diabetes, as I said, various forms of cancers,
Would not be far from.
yeah, hypertension,
Yeah.
AIDS, HIV, and now COVID-19. I mean, Black people in Canada, are at the top of the pile, the top of this ladder when it comes to who is suffering the most from COVID-19, who are the victims, people who are dying, people who are infected, and who are the frontline workers, especially in the health field and the retail industry. These are Black community. A third impact is segregation. As I've said, after emancipation happened, you had legal segregation, whether it was Jim Crow in the United States or the color bar in Canada. So the Black schools were segregated. It's the school system. The government passed in various places in Canada, passed these school acts that segregated Black learners. Cemeteries were segregated, churches, and just a lack of employment opportunities. Even if you're very qualified, you have a PhD, you have the credentials, there's so much difficulty in finding work. There's some what one could call good legacies, and I'm speaking about the area of culture. So, in terms of food, cuisine, fashion, art, literature, music. So, every form of music within the Americas, every single one, um, popular music came from Africa, came out of the slavery experience, whether it's salsa, whether it's bachata, whether it's merengue, whether it's reggae, whether it's a soca, Jazz, blues, hip hop, rap, dancehall, you name it. It all came out of the slave experience. Unfortunately, in most cases, Black people are not the beneficiaries
Yeah.
of the wealth
Yeah.
that's accrued from these industries. We have what I call, the vulturization of our culture. Other people take it, they benefit from it. I mean, if you think of who really owns the music industry in North America,
Yeah.
it's not the rappers, it's not the Black singers, it's other people, it's white people, predominantly white men who run the music industry, who accrue the millions and billions, who own the masters
Mm.
of these artists and musicians. So, as much as this could be seen as a good legacy, we have imprinted ourselves in culture in North America and the rest of the Americas. We're the leaders in popular culture. It's our music that makes um, thing, um, things happen. If you look at the leading musicians, artists, Michael Jackson, Beyonce, Prince, Peter Tosh, so on and so forth, they're the ones who drive the industry or who have driven the industry.
Which also now brings me to my next question, because it's very easy for Canadians to say, oh, the role that Canada played, in slavery was not as bad as other places. And usually the focus is on the underground train system. Can
Right.
we look at specific ways, in which the colonial economy in the Maritimes, or places like Nova Scotia, in Canada generally, where you have studied, how, you know, they made their wealth, how the colonial economy was riding on the back of slavery and slave trade?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And you've used the right word. Right phrase. It's a colonial economy. So there are these various colonies around the Atlantic world. British colonies, sometimes French, Dutch, Spanish, but we'll just stick to the British world. And so, if I'll just give one example, and this is how Nova Scotia and the Maritime were inserted in the slaving system, in the British slaving system. So you have the Maritimes colonies, in eastern Canada, sitting on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Down the road is, or down the sea roads, are the Caribbean colonies. They are predominantly slave colonies, and you did have slavery within the Maritimes too. But the Maritimes was a poorer part of Canada, and
Mm.
so it needed, as we say in Jamaican language, it needed a forward. And how did the Maritimes get that forward? They got it through the Caribbean slavery system. When I say they needed a forward, they needed a way to create wealth. And so they inserted themselves in the Atlantic commercial system and in the global commercial system by trading with the Caribbean slave plantations. And this is how they did it. In the Maritimes, what do we have? Fish. We're by the sea.
Yes.
We have fish. And so they exported dried fish, whether it's cod, herring, mackerel, haddock, etc., to the Caribbean colonies to feed the enslaved people. So these were the main protein sources, the cod and herring of enslaved people. Hence the high salt content we're talking about, the hypertension and so on, because they salted it in order to preserve it. That fed the slaves. The Maritimes also exported beef, pork, all salted,
Mm.
horses, timber, staves, lumber, wheat flour to the Caribbean slave plantations. What did they get in exchange for the maritime products that were sent down south to the Caribbean? They got the maritime businessmen, they got rum, sugar, molasses, coffee, cocoa, all of the goods that were produced by slave labor. And that is how, you have a coterie of merchants, so that was in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, who gained their wealth, who made their fortunes from this trade. So basically, the maritime economy was premised on the backs of enslaved Caribbean people. And the blood, when we say what the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved people, I am also speaking in a literal way.
Yeah.
Because so many times when the sugar was being produced, so you had the molasses, you had the cane juice, and you boil it. You had to boil it to thicken it, and then it eventually crystallizes to become sugar. But that was a very labor intensive task, and it was done in the boiling houses and at night. And so many times the person who is like feeding the mill is drowsy because he or she had been standing there for hours during the night, and they sometimes their arm would get caught in the mill, the rotating mill. And in order to prevent the whole body from being dragged into the mill, there was a person, another enslaved person, or it could be a white person who was standing there with a machete, and they would chop off the arm. And so the blood, the arm, everything would be crushed, would be grinded up, would be part of the semi-liquid. And so, that person who chops off the arm, that was actually a job. That was a job within the sugar making system. There's a person there standing with a machete to chop off that arm if that arm gets caught. So when I say it's the blood, sweat, and tears, I really mean it in a literal way. So that sugar comes up to Nova Scotia, comes up to New Brunswick, comes up to Newfoundland, and wherever else, Quebec, Ontario, and is consumed by everybody, whether it's the governor of the province or the ordinary, humble farmer, yeoman, the school teacher, by everybody, by every sector of society.
This discussion will be continued in the next episode. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sankofa Pan-African series channel. Like our videos and please share them with your contacts.